At exactly 12 noon, as the rope tightened around her neck, the townsfolk froze. A shadow fell across the gallows, tall as a church spire, broad as a canyon wall. He didn't say a word, just tore the beam from its hinges with one hand and cradled her belly with the other. She wasn't supposed to live. The child wasn't supposed to be born. But what the giant cowboy did next turned the whole town against him and saved them all. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wood split like thunder under heaven, sending the gallows beam crashing to the dirt as silence swallowed the town of Dagger Creek whole just one breath after the noose should have ended a life. The woman Etta, her name barely remembered among the rumors, hung limp in the arms of the man who'd caught her fall. Not a word from him. Not a question from the crowd. Just the sound of rope uncoiling and wind rushing through the square like it knew something sacred had been torn loose. The sheriff, Briggs, a barrel-chested man with hands always hovering too close to his gun, found his voice, barked it out like a whip crack. "Draw." But his deputies hesitated. One man lowered his hand. Another just stared, jaw working, sweat gleaming like guilt on his brow. They'd all seen it. The way the stranger stood, not defiant, not proud, but still like a monument the years forgot, draped in dust and silence, taller than any man ought to be. With shoulders wide enough to blot the noonday Sunday, Etta's eyes fluttered open, her breath ragged, hands rising to touch the raw red welt around her throat. She clutched at the stranger's shirt, not in fear, but in something older, deeper. Recognition, maybe, or hope. Around them, the townsfolk watched from windows and porches, caught between awe and dread. No one spoke. No one ran. Only the sheriff stepped forward, spitting anger. "You just bought yourself a noose, big man." The stranger said nothing, didn't flinch. His eyes dark, distant, ancient, met the sheriff's and held them like steel biting into bone. Then he turned, slowly, gently shifting Etta's weight in his arms, and walked down the gallows steps like he owned them. Dust followed his heels. Somewhere, a child cried. Somewhere else, a man whispered, "That's him. It's Stone." And the name moved like a chill wind, sweeping from ear to ear, stirring old stories, half-believed and long-buried, about a cowboy the size of a tree, who didn't speak much but always showed up when death came early. Briggs barked again, voice faltering, but his men didn't move. One backed away, another dropped his rifle. The air itself seemed to lean toward the stranger, as if trying to remember him. And in the silence, Stone passed the edge of the gallows, past the line where shadow met sun, carrying Etta like a broken promise. He didn't look back, didn't explain, just vanished into the shimmering heat at the end of the street while the town heaved into a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when the world you knew has already started to change. By sundown, Dagger Creek was humming with whispers, low, sharp, careful things that passed through saloon shutters and behind prayerful hands, seeping into the seams of the town like smoke that wouldn't clear. Word spread faster than fire in dry brush. The giant who broke the gallows was no stranger, no hired gun or outlaw brute. He was Stone. The ghost of a man half the town had consigned to legend, the other half to guilt. Some remembered him clearer than they cared to admit how he'd once walked barefoot into the depths of the Blister Ridge mine when it caught fire, hauling children out one by one, his arms black with soot, his back burned raw, saying nothing even as his skin peeled from his bones. Others recalled the trial that never happened, the blood feud with the McCaw brothers, the gun that never fired, the bodies buried quiet behind the church. Then he was gone, disappeared into the Rockies like a shadow swallowed by fog. That was 10 years ago. Now he'd come back, not as a whisper, but as a reckoning. And he hadn't come alone. He was holding Etta Hollings, the mayor's only daughter, bruised, barefoot, and pregnant. Her lips blue from the rope they tried to hang her with. Folks who'd cheered her sentence that very morning now watched the horizon, faces pale, stomachs twisting with a strange, unnameable doubt. She was supposed to be guilty. Had to be. Killed her husband. They said a righteous man, a landowner, a veteran, a protector. That's what the sheriff told them. What the mayor swore. What the town needed to believe. But some had seen the way she flinched when her husband came near. how she stopped smiling the day the wedding band appeared on her hand, the way her eyes darted to the floor every time she spoke. Now those same people wondered how a man like Stone, who hadn't spoken a word in years, who lived like a ghost in the high canyons and never took sides, would risk his life for a woman like that, unless something deeper than words told him she was innocent. The saloon keeper swore he saw Stone once cradle a dying coyote just to ease its last breath. The blacksmith recalled how Stone used to trade silver buttons for nails but never haggled, never asked for more. And the preacher, who'd buried Stone's mother after the fever, remembered how the boy didn't cry, not even once, just stood in the rain outside the chapel until his boots filled with mud. That man, the preacher said in a trembling voice, doesn't take life lightly. And as the wind howled through the empty gallows that night, and the mayor locked his doors while the sheriff paced with a loaded rifle, the town of Dagger Creek sat on the edge of a secret it had buried too deep, and now, too late, could feel rising through the dirt. It started with bruises no one dared name and papers no one dared question. Etta Hollings, daughter of Mayor Thaddeus Hollings, married off like cattle to Cyrus Finch, a land baron with a voice like gravel and hands that knew only how to take. Folks said it was a union of power, a way to fuse two dynasties and lock down water rights north of the Bitter Ridge, but behind the white lace veil and the riverfront homestead was a silence thick with bruised skin, shattered plates, and the kind of screaming that never reached the town square. Cyrus was rich, mean, and sacred to the sheriff, who owed him more than coin. They'd buried secrets together back when the railroad came and the law looked the other way. When Etta tried to flee, she was dragged back under cover of night, broken, barefoot, forced to sign away her birthright to the Hollings ranch while her father turned his face to the wall. Her belly swelled with child, but her voice grew quieter until it nearly disappeared. Then, one storm-heavy night, the ranch house burned slow and black into the dirt, and Cyrus was found in the ashes, throat slit, safe broken open, and a bloodied knife in Etta's hands as she knelt in the mud, dazed, her eyes empty like the wind had carried her soul away. The sheriff didn't ask questions, didn't need to. The trial was set within hours. No jury, no defense, no mercy. The noose was prepared before her confession was even forged. But what the sheriff never found, what was never entered into evidence, was the small black ledger buried beneath a loose stone in the barn, left behind by Cyrus in a drunken haze. Inside were names, land deeds taken by force, confessions scrawled under duress, threats logged like inventory, payouts to men with badges and robes, accounts of cruelty too cruel to invent. And tucked in the back, wrapped in wax paper like a keepsake, was a photograph. Etta at 17, standing beside her mother before the woman died, sunlight caught in her smile, unaware that her life had already been sold. That ledger never surfaced in the trial because the sheriff made sure it didn't. But someone else had found it, someone who knew how to move through silence like smoke, someone who had once been forced to sign a life away in blood. That man was Stone. He had seen the same ledger 10 years earlier, when Cyrus tried to take his family's land by force. Stone had walked away then, trying to leave violence behind. But now, with Etta's unborn child hanging from the end of a rope, and the same crooked ink soaking new pages, the fire that Stone had buried in the mountains woke again. He came not just for justice but for penance. And as Etta lay cradled in his arms, barely breathing, the weight of her story wrapped in bruises and silence, it wasn't her voice that demanded to be heard. It was the blood in the ledger, still wet in his memory. The storm came down like judgment, hammering the blackened ribs of the old church beyond Dustmill Canyon, where moss and time had devoured the steeple and bats whispered scripture from the rafters. Yet it was the only place far enough, broken enough, forgotten enough to hold them without questions. Etta lay curled on the pew's edge, wrapped in a torn horse blanket, her breathing shallow, her hands protectively cradling the life inside her that kicked softly, as if trying to remind her the world hadn't ended yet. She didn't cry for herself, hadn't since the first time Cyrus slammed her head against the stove. But tonight, under the ruined cross and bleeding rain, her sobs came in waves, low and aching, not out of fear but out of guilt, as if she'd already failed the child she hadn't yet met. Stone didn't comfort her. He didn't move. He just sat cross-legged by the fire he built from hymnals and rotted pew legs, his massive frame flickering in the orange light like something half-carved from mountain rock, his wet coat steaming, his face carved tight with something too old for anger and too deep for grief. In his left hand, clenched so hard his knuckles paled beneath the dirt, was a small silver locket tarnished, bent at the hinge, but whole. Every so often he opened it with a flick of his thumb and stared at the photograph inside, a face long gone, a memory still bleeding, before snapping it shut and squeezing until his fingers shook. He hadn't said a word since they'd fled the gallows, since he carried her through thorned ravines and sunken gullies, all the way to this ruin of mercy, and still he said nothing now. But his silence was louder than thunder. The rain wept through the roof and kissed his shoulders like penance, soaking the wood around him until it hissed. At one point, Etta reached out and whispered, "Why me?" And though she meant it for God or fate or the storm, Stone turned his head slightly, just enough to see her face through the glow, and something passed between them, not pity, not promise, but understanding, deep as roots and sharp as nails. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Somewhere in the darkness a wolf howled, distant and hollow. Stone's lips parted. His voice, when it came, was so rough it seemed torn from the rocks themselves. "No more graves," he said, and though it was only 4 words, they cracked through the church like gunfire, echoing off the bones of saints and sinners alike. Etta closed her eyes. The baby shifted beneath her ribs. And outside, as the first light of dawn crawled over the canyon's edge, the rain slowed, softened, and for the first time in years, Stone looked up not to the heavens, but to the road ahead, already knowing that every step forward would cost him everything he hadn't buried yet. By morning, the sun hadn't yet dried the mud beneath the gallows when the first posters went up, rough parchment slapped against saloon doors, nailed to feed store posts, fluttering from the church gate like grim little flags of war. Wanted Jonathan Stone, Crow, dead or alive. Below the name, sketched in rushed charcoal, was the face of a man too wide for the frame, eyes shadowed, jaw set like a blade. Sheriff Briggs didn't waste time. He gathered his deputies at dawn, rode to every outpost within a 2-day ride, and let the offer ring out like a bell. 500 in gold and a quarter section of land, to any man who brings in Stone, breathing or not. The bounty spread like a fever. But so did the unease. Men stared at the posters longer than they should have, remembering things they hadn't spoken of in years, how Stone once rode into the middle of the Ryland cattle feud and knocked both leaders off their horses before they could draw, forcing a truce with nothing but silence and the weight of his stare. How he'd once found a lost boy in a sandstorm and carried him back to his mother with cracked feet and sunburned eyes, never asking for thanks. How he'd stopped a lynching in Redbone Hollow with a single whispered word. Some folks owed him their lives. Others owed him their guilt. The blacksmith kept his hammer low that day, refusing to shoe the horses of bounty riders. The preacher said nothing in the pulpit, but quietly unlocked the back of the church for a stranger in a poncho who never gave his name. At the general store, old Mrs. Dietz, who hadn't walked without a cane since the war, spat on the poster before tearing it down with shaking hands. "He carried my boy out of the cholera camps," she muttered, voice thick with memory. "Didn't even take water." And still the posters multiplied. Briggs paced behind his desk, chewing the butt of a cigar, knowing the town's silence wasn't loyalty, it was friction, dry and waiting for spark. He rode out that evening, climbed the steps of the mayor's porch, and slammed his palm down hard. "If your girl isn't found by sundown tomorrow," he growled, "we call in the Pinkertons. No more chances. No more mercy." But even the mayor looked unsure now, hands trembling as he wiped sweat from his collar, staring at a half-finished letter he couldn't bring himself to send. As night fell, men rode out in different directions, some for gold, some for vengeance, and a quiet few with canteens and blankets, heading into the canyons with no name, where they'd once seen a giant cowboy carry hope on his back. The town of Dagger Creek didn't speak its heart aloud, but it beat just beneath the floorboards, steady, uncertain, afraid of what it meant to stand between law and justice. And somewhere beyond the ridgelines, Stone waited, knowing they would come, not all as enemies, and not all as friends. It began just before dusk, with Etta doubled over on the stone floor of the ruined church, hands clutching her swollen belly, sweat pouring despite the cool air, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts that echoed off the rotting walls like gunshots. Too early, too fast. The baby was coming, and Stone knew before she said a word. He laid her down gently, eyes flicking over her trembling frame, then stood without hesitation, already reaching for the rope that held his saddle cinched outside. There was no doctor in Dagger Creek who would come, not after the posters, not after the sheriff made it clear anyone who aided them would be tried as accomplices. So he rode alone, unarmed, straight into the lion's mouth, through the salt flats and dry ravines, past the sheriff's barricade that curled like a snake around the main road where 10 rifles waited and every man behind them had a reason to shoot. But Stone didn't flinch. He rode slow, tall in the saddle, his empty hands lifted just slightly, the reins draped loose over the horn like a man with nothing left to hide. Windows cracked open. Children pressed their faces to glass. Men on porches lowered their eyes as he passed. They didn't cheer, but they didn't stop him either. The deputies didn't fire, not one. Some looked away. One crossed himself. The road to the Black Ridge tribe twisted high into the mesa country, where red stone cliffs caught the last of the light and the air turned thin and sharp with pine and memory. That's where he found her singing bird, the old midwife with eyes like stormwater and hands steady enough to guide life between death's fingers. She stood outside her tent before he even called out, as if she'd felt the tremor of purpose in the dust. "It's her?" she asked, and when Stone nodded once, barely, she didn't ask another question. She packed herbs, cloth, blades, tied her braids, climbed up behind him without a word. Years ago, she'd pulled a bullet from Stone's back with a sharpened bone needle, whispered to his ghost until it crawled back into his chest. That kind of bond never broke. They rode back fast, dusk bleeding into night, the canyon winds wailing like spirits trying to keep pace. At the church, Etta screamed beneath the cracked crucifix, her cries raw and ragged, her body twisting under a pain no lawman could outlaw. And in that moment, as Singing Bird knelt beside her, and Stone lit the fire one-handed, the past and present braided together, this was not just survival, it was defiance. The baby wasn't just flesh and blood. It was proof. Proof that mercy could still bloom in poisoned soil, that even hunted men and broken women could build something unkillable. And all across Dagger Creek, behind drawn curtains and closed mouths, the people knew. If the child lived, so would the truth. The church was thick with the smell of blood and sage, the floor soaked with sweat, rainwater, and the sharp metallic scent of birth clawing its way into the world while Etta screamed through clenched teeth, and Singing Bird murmured steady rhythms in her native tongue, guiding life like a thread through the needle's eye. Stone knelt just beyond the light of the fire, shoulders hunched, hands splayed on the ground as if trying to keep the earth from spinning out beneath him. The sound of Etta's agony drilling straight into the bones he'd thought long ago turned to stone. Outside, wind howled through broken windows and ash from the fire danced in the air like ghosts shaken loose. And maybe they were because Stone saw them now. Faces in the flame, memories wrapped in heat and regret. His father's silence, his mother's bruises, and his brother Cyrus laughing, always laughing, behind a glass of whiskey, knife tucked behind his belt like a promise he never kept. He hadn't said it aloud in years, not even to himself, but now it rose like a flood from the place he'd buried it, words ragged and cracked like old leather. "He was my brother," he said, voice low, eyes fixed on the coals. Singing Bird didn't look up, just nodded once, steady, as her hands worked fast and precise between Etta's thighs. "I left home when he first took land that wasn't his. Thought walking away was mercy. Thought the mountains would keep the guilt from following. But it don't wash off," he said, staring at the flicker of firelight that danced over the cracked altar. "He beat her. Beat others too. I knew. I knew." His voice broke, sharp and sudden, and for a moment, Stone was just a man again, not the legend, not the giant, not the ghost who stopped gallows, but a brother who'd walked too far from justice and come back too late. "She's paying for what I let live," he whispered, the words sticking in his throat like splinters. "I thought if I never raised my hand, I'd be better than him. But all I did was leave the devil in charge of the fire." His fists clenched in the dirt. "I should have stopped him. I should have ended it years ago." For a moment, nothing but Etta's ragged breathing filled the space. Then a hand firm, warm, unshaking, rested on his shoulder. Singing Bird didn't stop her work, didn't soften her voice. She just said, "Then let the child be your beginning." And in that moment, those 6 words held more weight than all the guilt in his chest. Stone looked up, eyes wet, jaw set, and the fire didn't burn so hot anymore, it just pulsed, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. Etta cried out one last time, and then a sound split the air sharper than thunder, a newborn's first wail, loud and alive, the sound of redemption cutting through ruin. Stone bowed his head, not in shame, but in prayer, though no words followed. The ghosts were still there, but so was something new. Morning broke like judgment, pale and slow, dragging gold across the rooftops of Dagger Creek as the townsfolk woke to something heavier than silence, a feeling, thick in the chest, like the hush before a storm that already knows its name. And then he came. Stone. Walking down the center of Main Street with dust rising at his heels, coat open to the wind, face unreadable, and a set of iron shackles clutched in his right hand, not on him, but for someone else. The church bell didn't ring, but the sound of boots on wood, curtains twitching, and rifles shifting behind doors rose around him like a chorus. No one spoke as he passed. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office, stood in the shadow of its crooked sign, and dropped the chains onto the dirt with a sound that echoed off the buildings like thunder made of steel and memory. Trial. He said just one word, low and quiet, but it shook the street harder than gunfire. Sheriff Briggs burst from his office red-faced, revolver already halfway out of the holster, voice a snarl. There ain't no trial for outlaws. But Stone didn't flinch, just reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the black ledger, the one taken from Cyrus Finch's safe before the fire, pages wrapped in oilskin and heavy with ink and consequence. He opened it and read slowly, clearly names, amounts, dates, details of bribes paid to Briggs and his deputies to seize land from widows and smallholders, records of forced confessions, one line that read, E.H. signed at gunpoint, witness, T.H. That one hit like a bullet. The mayor staggered where he stood behind the general store window. The crowd thickened, shopkeepers, ranch hands, women with aprons still stained from breakfast. A few men lowered their rifles. A few more looked down at their boots. The preacher stepped forward and stood beside Stone without a word. Briggs tried to laugh, but it caught in his throat. You got no authority here, he said, but no one answered. Because they all remembered. They remembered how Stone had once delivered a rustler to justice bound and breathing, not bleeding. They remembered the boy he'd carried out of the storm. They remembered the gallows beam breaking like judgment. Stone stepped forward and laid the ledger on the bench in front of the jailhouse door, then pointed at the chains. These are for the guilty, he said, and this time, no one doubted who he meant. Etta stood at the edge of the crowd, baby wrapped to her chest, pale but unbroken. Her father fell to his knees. The town held its breath. And then, like dust shaken from an old coat, the truth spilled out slow at first, then rushing. Voices from the crowd, testimonies once swallowed in fear, confessions long buried. A trial began, not in a courtroom, but in the square, with the people as judge, and history bending under the weight of what had been hidden too long. Justice, for the first time, found its voice, and it sounded an awful lot like mercy with a spine. They offered him absolution wrapped in law, clean paper, clean slate, the mayor's trembling signature already scrawled at the bottom as if that alone could erase a decade of silence and fire, but Stone didn't even look at it. He stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand, wind tugging at the hem of his coat like a farewell already written, his eyes not on the men who had finally chosen to stand with him, but on the child cradled in Etta's arms, blinking up at the sky for the first time, as if trying to memorize it. Sheriff Briggs and 3 of his deputies had been taken into custody, their own shackles dragging behind them like truth finally catching up. The trial was done, the crowd dispersing, the town quiet not with fear, but with the strange weight that follows change, like everyone was still waiting for the ground to settle. Stone had done what he came to do. He had broken the silence, cracked it wide open with firelight, testimony, and the oldest kind of justice, the kind built not on blood, but on bearing the cost yourself. The mayor stepped forward, offered him the paper with shaking hands, voice brittle. You saved her, he said, glancing at Etta and the babe. You saved us. Take this. Stay. But Stone only shook his head, slow and certain, like a man too old for illusions. Peace bought cheap don't last, he said, voice barely above the wind. If it don't cost nothing, it don't mean nothing. Then he walked to where Etta sat beneath the sycamore tree, her face pale but peaceful, baby wrapped in blue cloth stitched with pieces of Stone's old poncho. He knelt beside them, the ground groaning beneath his weight, and reached into his pocket, pulling out the silver locket bent at the hinge, tarnished at the edge, but whole, and placed it gently into the baby's tiny hands. She gripped it like she knew it mattered. Stone didn't smile, but something behind his eyes flickered like dawn rising slow. "She'll know why we stood," he whispered, and Etta, eyes wet but unbroken, nodded. "And she'll know who stood." The preacher tried to speak, the mayor tried to protest, but Stone had already stood, already turned, already walking toward the canyon rim where the road vanished into sagebrush and silence. No horse, no bags, just a man walking west, one step at a time, like exile was a trail he knew by heart. And no one stopped him. They just watched, holding breath, holding memory, until the wind swallowed him whole and the dust settled again. That night, the gallows were torn down plank by plank, and in their place, someone planted a sapling. A quiet start, a costly piece, but something, at last, that might grow. The wind was gentler now in Dagger Creek, but the dust still rose when the noon sun hit just right. Same crossroads, same hills beyond the town, but the silence had changed. It no longer held fear, only memory. On the edge of where the gallows once stood, now marked only by a young sycamore tree, tall and stubborn, a woman dismounted her horse, boots hitting earth like punctuation on a long sentence finally coming to rest. She wore her hair in a single braid, dark as her mother's, and around her neck, catching the sunlight with every step, hung a worn silver locket with a bent hinge and a history no one dared question. Her name was Clara, but the old ones called her the child of the noon sun, born on a storm-racked day when truth clawed its way into the world, and saved by a man who never asked to be remembered. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the weight of silence but had chosen speech anyway. Her steps leading her to a plot of land where hammers now struck wood, and beams rose like hopeful ribs toward the sky. The school wasn't much, 2 rooms, a bell tower still under construction, but it stood on principle, on purpose, on the buried remnants of gallows and guilt. Clara didn't teach from books alone. She taught from the ledger copies made from the one her mother had hidden all those years, now bound and shelved behind her desk. She taught history not as facts, but as choices. And when her students asked who the man in the photograph was, the one by the blackboard, wide-shouldered, fire-lit, face caught between sorrow and strength, she'd smile a quiet, crooked smile and say, "That was my father." He didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. Folks said she carried something of the giant in her, not his size, maybe, but the stillness, the way she looked a man in the eye and made him rethink the lie he was about to tell. She didn't carry a gun. She didn't need to. Her voice could cut just as sharp. The preacher, older now and slower, swore she once stared down a railroad foreman twice her age when he tried to bribe the town council. She didn't raise her voice, he said, but I swear the air got colder. Every year, on the day they once called Hanging Day, Clara rang the school bell 12 times at noon, not for mourning, for memory. Children stood quiet in the yard, hand over heart, not because they were told to, but because they understood something sacred had happened long before they were born. The sheriff's office now served as a library. The old jail held shelves, not cells. And in the heart of Dagger Creek, where once they had built gallows out of fear, there now stood something sturdier, justice, yes, but also hope. And though no one had seen him in years, some swore that when the wind blew just right, the leaves on the sycamore rustled like footsteps heading west.